Ordinarily, we would be doing a What is Written study this morning, but I want to preach the sermon that I intended to preach last week, and we'll bump the What is Written study back a week. You may remember that a couple of weeks ago I preached a lesson that I entitled, When God Says Nothing, He Means No. And we focused on 4 lessons from 2 Samuel chapter 7. The first lesson, man doesn't think like God. David thought that building a temple for God was a good idea. He thought God would be pleased, but that wasn't really God's plan. And then a second lesson, man can't read God's mind. Obviously, if David had been able to read the mind of God, he would not have proposed building a temple. And we also noted that preachers can be wrong. When David proposed building a temple to the prophet Nathan, Nathan thought it was a great idea. In fact, he said, "Go, the Lord is with you," but Nathan was wrong about that. And so we can't just accept anything that a preacher might say, because preachers can make mistakes. But then we focus most of our time on this fourth and final lesson. When God says nothing, He means no. And we said 3 things about that point, trying to emphasize the significance of this principle. And the first thing that we pointed out is that repeatedly in God's Word, in many different ways, God tells us, "Don't tamper with my Word." For example, He told the Israelites not to add to or take from what He had commanded. He told them not to turn aside to the right hand or the left. Paul told the Galatians in Galatians chapter 1 that anyone who preached a different gospel was accursed. And Paul told Timothy that those who teach a different doctrine are filled with pride and they know nothing. Repeatedly, God says, "Don't tamper with my word." And then we also looked at some examples from the Old Testament where the faithful among God's people did not take action unless and until they received instruction from God. And then we noticed that God punishes presumption. When Nadab and Abihu offered profane or strange fire that God had not commanded them to offer, God sent fire and consumed them. When preachers talk about the silence of God being prohibitive rather than permissive, there are a lot of people who think that preachers are inconsistent in the application of this principle. And they will ask, well, where does God say anything about church buildings and carpet on the floor, lights and pews and baptistries and microphones, pitch pipes, data projectors, preaching on the radio, preaching on TV? Where has God said anything about those things? Well, that's a good question. And I think that I can provide you with a good answer. As you think with me about our study this morning, when God says something. Now, I hope it is readily apparent to you that this sermon is intended to be a follow-up sermon to the one that I preached a couple of weeks ago. And I understand that I may not say anything that you don't already know, but I do want to help you understand an important principle of communication. And I want to help you be able to explain this principle to others in a clear way. Notice how I said that. I said that we would be talking about a principle of communication. We're not so much talking about a biblical principle, and what we'll be talking about is certainly not some kind of Church of Christ made-up hermeneutic. We're going to be talking about a principle of communication. In other words, we're going to be talking about how communication works. Whether you're talking about the kind of communication that we engage in with one another, or whether you're talking about the kind of communication that God has engaged with His people. When God says something, He doesn't say everything. By that I mean He doesn't specify all the details. He specifies some details and He leaves other details unspecified. That means that when God specifies something, we must do exactly what God has specified. But if God has left certain details unspecified, then we may or must make choices concerning those unspecified details. When it comes to instruction, we need to understand that instruction will fall somewhere on a continuum, running from one detail. I mean, you've got to have at least one detail or you don't have any instruction, to every possible detail involved. Sometimes preachers talk about instruction that contains few details as being generic instruction. By that we mean it is imprecise, inexact, indefinite, vague, undetailed. If there are many details, preachers sometimes talk about specific instruction. And by that we mean instruction that is precise, exact, definite, distinct, detailed. Regardless of what instruction you're talking about, it will fall on this continuum of running from at least one detail to the maximum number of details. And I'm going to tip my hand just a little bit here. I dare say that we never supply the maximum number of details. And that's just the way communication works. Several different definitions are given for the English word general. Focus on the fifth definition from the American Heritage Dictionary. They tell us that the word means involving only the main or more obvious features of something, lacking detail or precision. Some instruction is like that. They define the word specific to mean explicitly set forth, particular, or definite. Generic instruction contains fewer details, and therefore it is more imprecise, inexact, and indefinite. Specific instruction contains more details, and therefore it is more precise, exact, and definite. Maybe I can illustrate my point like this. If I were to say to this group of people, "Get me some pizza," I would have specified, assuming that I have the authority to issue this instruction. Humor me, go with me here. Let's assume that I do, all right? I would have specified that I wanted something done, and I would have specified locomotion in the word get, and I would have specified that I wanted pizza. But I would not have specified several other things. I would not have specified who is to go get the pizza, although you might well assume that this instruction would be confined only to those who are in this room right now. But that could involve any one of you, or a combination of some of you, or I suppose you all could just leave the building and go to follow my instructions. I haven't specified where you are to get the pizza. You could run home and you could pull a frozen pizza out of your freezer, or you could go to Kroger and buy one, or you could go to a restaurant, or you could go home and make a pizza. And if you supplied the pizza in any of those ways, would you have followed my instructions? Do this. Yes. Yes. When I say, "Get me some pizza," I have not specified how you are to go in getting the pizza. You could walk, you could ride a bike, you could ride a bus or a car, you could take a cab. And when I say, "Get me some pizza," I haven't really specified when you are to do that, although you might well assume that I would want you to do that in a reasonably short period of time. I have not specified how much pizza. Right? And I have not specified what kind of pizza. And so you could come back with an all-cheese pizza, or a pizza with pepperoni and hamburger and all the veggies, a super supreme pizza from Pizza Hut. Instruction can encompass several different questions, like who, what, when, where, why, how much, how often, what kind, and no doubt other details as well. And typically, some details will be specified and other details will be left unspecified. That's just the way communication works. I'll illustrate that more in a moment. As I've already suggested, you can tell I'm not 100%. I specified some details when I say, "Get me some pizza." But I could be more specific. I could supply more details. I could say, "Mark, here's the money. Go get me some pizza." Or I could say, "John, here's the money. Take my car right now. Go to the Pizza Hut and buy one large super supreme pizza and bring it right back to me." Have I specified all of the details when I say that to John? No, I really haven't. Because I could say to John, John, here's the money, take my car, turn left on Courtland, left on Markland, go around or go halfway through the roundabout, go down to Berkeley, turn right, go up to Sycamore, and turn left. Is the Pizza Hut on Sycamore or Jefferson? I don't remember. Anyway, you understand my point, right? Even though when you specify several details, there is almost always more details that you could specify. That's just the way communication works. That's the way we communicate with one another, and that's the way God communicates with us in His Word. And so we shouldn't be surprised by anything that I'm saying this morning when I say, when God says something, He doesn't say everything. When Isaac gets a little older and he gets in school, and Holly says to Isaac, Isaac, do your homework. Well, Isaac's going to understand that that involves whatever is involved in doing your homework. And when Isaac gets a little older, I'm picking on Isaac this morning, and Barry says, Isaac, mow the yard. And I do hope that there will come a time when Barry will say that to Isaac, because Isaac needs to learn to work and he needs to have some chores to do. You are planning to do that, are you not, Barry? He's nodding his head. Yes, I'm glad to hear that. But when Barry tells Isaac, mow the yard, he doesn't have to tell him, now son, that means go out to the garage, turn the switch, and if it's a push mower, do we even have push mowers anymore? That's what I used growing up. And pull the cord, and if you have to mess with the choke, you do that. You see, Barry doesn't have to specify all those details, and yet those details are involved in mowing the yard. And Barry doesn't have to say to Isaac, now Isaac, I want you to mow the front yard, and then both side yards, and then the backyard. Now Barry could specify that, and if he did, Isaac better do what his dad tells him to do. And one of these days, when Holly says to Ava, clean your room, that's going to involve whatever is involved in cleaning your room. Are you with me? Do you see my point? That's just the way communication works. So let's offer some illustrations from the Word of God. In Genesis chapter 22, God told Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. And we can't take the time to read this passage. You are familiar with those instructions. But when you read this account, you find out that Abraham took 2 of his servants with him. And he took a donkey. And he took wood for the burnt offering, and fire, and a knife. And when he got to the land of Moriah, he constructed an altar. Now, were any of these things mentioned specifically in God's instructions to Abraham? No. They were not mentioned, but they were authorized by God's instructions, because they were either essential to carrying out the instruction, or they were expedient or helpful in carrying out God's instructions. When the Lord authorizes an act to be performed, whatever is essential or expedient to carry out that act is authorized by the Lord's instructions. Just like telling Isaac, mow the yard, telling Ava, clean your room. Well, in Genesis chapter 6, God told Noah to build an ark. And I want you to notice that there were some things that God specified in those instructions, and there were other things that he left unspecified. That's what the S and the U stands for on the chart. God specified the builder. Noah was to build the ark. And he specified the object that Noah was to build. He was to build an ark. But now, when was Noah to get started on this building project? God left that unspecified. Where was Noah to build the ark? God didn't say. He left that unspecified. Now, God did specify the material. God told Noah to build an ark of gopher wood. But let's suppose that there were various varieties of gopher wood, like there's various varieties of oak. Red oak, white oak, black oak. You're with me, right? Live oak. Well, let's suppose there were different varieties of gopher wood. Could Noah have used a particular variety or a combination of varieties of gopher wood in building the... Of course he could. God specified the dimensions of the ark, how long it was to be, how high, how wide. But now God did not specify the construction method. He didn't say anything about tools. But now I ask you, would it have been possible for Noah to build an ark without tools? Well, I don't see how. God didn't specify the time frame for building the ark, though we would rightly assume you need to get it built before the flood comes. God didn't specify the building schedule. All right, what days of the week are you going to work on the ark, and how long each day are you going to work? None of that is specified, and yet that is an inherent part of building an ark. Are you with me? There were some things that God specified concerning the Passover lamb. And there were other things that he left unspecified. He specified the kind of animal, and it was a lamb or a goat. I missed that second point for a while. God specified the sex. It was to be a male. But he didn't say anything about the color or the shade of color. He did specify the condition. It was to be without blemish. He specified the age. It was to be in the first year. How high or how tall was this lamb to be? God didn't say. What about its weight? God didn't say. What about its diet? God didn't say. Where do you kill this lamb? God didn't say. He said that the lamb was to be confined on the 10th day before it was killed on the 14th day, but he didn't say anything about the confinement method or the slaughter method. God did say something about how the lamb was to be prepared. It was to be roasted, not boiled. And he did specify some things about the consumption ritual. Are you seeing my point? One more illustration. We read about the purification rite associated with the red heifer in Numbers chapter 19, and God specifies the animal. It's not a male this time, it's a female. So he specifies the animal and the sex and the color. It's to be a red heifer. But now God didn't say anything about the shade of color. You know there's different shades of red, right? God did say that it was to be without blemish, but he didn't say anything about its age, though presumably it's a young cow, because heifer means a cow before she has a calf. Doesn't say anything about the height or the weight or the diet, the combustion method. God did specify that. He did specify the slaughter site. You see, there were things that God specified and there were other things that he left unspecified. And the Israelites were obligated to do everything that God specified, and with respect to these unspecified details, they could make some choices. Are you with me? All right, let's apply this. In the Great Commission, Jesus said, go. And he specified who was to go. It was to be the apostles, and what they were to do. They were to go, and where they were to go into all the world. But there were some unspecified details. How were they to go? Jesus doesn't say. And what order were they to go in? Well, we don't get any information about that in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, but we do get some information in Acts 1, verse 8, when Jesus said the apostles would be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. You see, there's an illustration where another passage can give us additional information that limits the teaching of another passage. Jesus said, teach. Well, there were some things he specified about that. He specified who was to do that, the apostles, what they were to teach the gospel, where they were to teach it in the world, but there's unspecified details. He doesn't specify when. He doesn't specify how. So, if I use a data projector, have I added to the Word of God? Or am I just using a tool like Noah used a tool to build the ark? I hope you see my point. The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, that we're not to forsake the coming together of the saints. And other passages indicate that Jesus wants Christians to assemble together, but that requires some things that are not specified in the New Testament. In order for two people to assemble together, you've got to agree on a certain time. And you've got to agree on a certain place. I think maybe this was before Kathy and I were dating. I was going to meet her at an Italian restaurant. And I got there and I went on in and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity. And Kathy was outside waiting in her car. You see, we hadn't... and the waiter finally said, I think maybe she's outside. If you're going to get together, you got to have a certain time and a certain place. And I would suggest to you that it needs to be an appropriate place for worship. If that's what we're talking about. Is anybody going to suggest that we ought to go down to the corner bar and that's where we ought to assemble during working hours to worship God? Anybody going to suggest something like that? Well, obviously not. And it's going to have to be an expedient place with respect to location, size, comfort. The church in Jerusalem was 3,000 strong on the day of Pentecost. Well, you're going to have a place that will accommodate that many people. And, of course, the temple was that kind of a place. And would anybody think it would be all right to break into a place so we could get together and assemble for worship? I mean, it needs to be a lawful place, right? And there's got to be some means for providing a place. We could borrow a place, buy a place, build a place, rent a place. But Jesus hasn't specified any of those details. He just says, assemble together. But you see, these are details that pertain to that instruction. Are you with me? Christians are to assemble, and they are to assemble, but when are we to assemble? Well, there's a couple of things that Jesus says we're to do on the first day of the week. We're to partake of the Lord's Supper, we're to give, but he hasn't specified where. He's given us some information about why. He hasn't said anything about how often, though I believe we should assemble every first day of the week to partake of the Lord's Supper. That's another sermon. He hasn't said anything about how long we assemble. And we're told to sing. Well, who is to do that is specified. What we're to sing is specified. Hymns. Why we're to do that is specified, to teach and admonish one another. But there are some unspecified details as to when and where and how we are to do that. Again, I cannot emphasize this too much. What we've been talking about is a principle of communication. It's just how communication works. And we should not be surprised that God communicates with us the same way that we communicate with one another. I'm out of time, but I leave you with my title. When God says something, he doesn't say everything. We must do whatever God says. We can choose with respect to unspecified details. So I hope this study will help you if somebody asks you, well, now, where's the authority for a church building? Or for songbooks and pews and data projectors, all these various things. Thank you.